Hi everybody. Full disclosure, I'm in my car again. This time I'm not driving while doing this. So, I guess we can be grateful of that, but, I rarely look at the camera anyways while at least in the last two when I actually was driving during the video, or at least sitting in traffic. Most of the time it's just me sitting in traffic at freight trains, and inevitably long freight trains, which I probably should do, or on 90 going someplace. Anyways, this time I'm in my car again. So forgive me when I mispronounce things, when I get dates wrong, when I get little facts wrong. You can't really count on memory as well as people like to think that they can. So anyways, what I would like to talk about now are the Crusades and how the Crusades are portrayed on social media and other YouTube videos I've been watching, and like discussions with people, and they're getting kind of a bad rap. I'm not saying that they were a good thing at all, but what I'm saying is, ostensibly, out of principle, most of what you are hearing now is just patently false. And I guess the best way to begin the discussion is, what is Charles Martel famous for? That would be like the best question to ask when you're discussing the Crusades, because right now it's being painted as an unwarranted act of Western aggression where they just came in to take over land that wasn't theirs and massacred a whole bunch of people, and they were the only ones at fault. And again, that's patently false. For those of you that aren't French, and for those of you that, like me, haven't majored in history, well, I majored in history, but those of you who haven't majored in history, those of you who don't have a degree in it, those of you who don't know anything about history, Charles Martel was one of the, if not the first Frankish king. And he came to power in 720 AD. He came to power around 720 AD. He was born, obviously much earlier than that. I want to say like around 680, something like that. But one of the first things that happened to him when he came into power was a pretty serious battle that changed the course of European history. And I actually think his dad was Pippin, so he would have been like one of the first, not the first. Like Pippin, I think, was the first, and then he spawned Martel, and then Martel, gave birth to Charlemagne, and everyone knows who Charlemagne is because of the Da Vinci Code. But back on track, back on point. When Charles Martel, he founded the Carolingian dynasty, but one of his first acts as king was to stop the Muslim conquest of France, and then eventually it would have spread out and taken over most of Europe, because they were on a drive to take over. It was a global domination drive. They were pushing to take over the entire known world, and Islam was still really, really new at this point. I want to say Muhammad was maybe 200 years dead at this point, so it's still a very, very young religion. He might have been 400 years dead. 200 years dead. I really want to say he was 200 years dead. Anyway, so what happened was, it was under the Caliphates. And the year was about 720, about the same time that Charles Martel came into power as the King of France. So it was one of his first big acts as king, as to my knowledge, from what I can recall off the top of my head. And the name of the Caliphate dynasty, if you guys want to look it up, is something I am not going to be able to pronounce. I want to say it's Umayyad. It's got a U at the beginning, it's got a D at the end, and it has a whole truckload of Y's in the middle of it. So it's the Umayyad Caliphate, and they were kind of storming into Europe. They had taken over, they had spread out from Saudi Arabia. They had gone in, taken over a whole bunch of Persia, massacred a whole bunch of Zoroastrians, pushed their way through Egypt, I want to say all the way over to around modern-day Morocco. I could be wrong about that. That could have come later. And then from there up till Spain, and then into France, where they were stopped by Charles Martel, also known as Charles the Hammer, and he got his name, from my understanding, from like stopping them dead in their tracks. And this is like it was he trounced them in the Battle of Toulouse or Toulouse, or if you're French, Toulouse, because you have to mumble off the last syllable of every word. But the Battle of Toulouse, roughly, is what I want to say. It's also called Toulouse, Toulouse, something like that. This all happened in 720. And if you did major in history and you read the accounts, the Muslims say that he just trounced them, and the French sources say that it was, an absolute French victory. So there really isn't that much room for like exaggeration there. And it just came out of nowhere, but they weren't expecting that, because Rome had only fallen about 300 years earlier, give or take, for something, when Alaric came steaming and took it. Europe, at least that part of Europe, was pushed into the Dark Ages, the very, very early Dark Ages. And one of the first things that happened was the Muslims came in and they started invading Europe, and they were pushed back to the Pyrenees by Charles Martel. And then afterwards, around the time of Columbus, is what was called the Reconquista of Spain, and they were more or less pushed out of a dominant political role in Spain. They weren't like completely massacred, but that did happen a lot of the times in the Spanish Inquisition. There's still Muslims in Spain if you go there, just like there's still Jews in Spain. So it wasn't the complete annihilation that you also hear about in social media, but it was an awful thing to do, and completely unnecessary, because it was just a push for political power. And I really do intend on having a video in the future about purges and revolutions and civil wars and how dangerous that can be, because people don't really realize how often it happens. Anyway, back to the story. It's 720 AD, and France starts to push the Muslims back. And like all things, it was a process. Tours is a bit north in France, a bit further north than people would think. A lot of people would think it would be like around Carcassonne, and kind of like, but no, it's a lot further north than that. It's almost out of Vichy, France area. So like you had to push them all the way back down, back into Spain, where they had the mountains to kind of separate the two of them. And that happened in around 720. I think like the battle might have actually happened in 724, give or take. Anyway, it was like decades of war to push them out. And then I also want to like bring apart like the reason why Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, and not getting into like the massive amount of disinformation that's out there about Columbus right now. But he sailed the ocean blue in 1492, kind of went from Spain over to the Americas. There's a reason why he did that, and that was the fall of Constantinople, which was again the Ottomans still trying to push their way into Europe and to finish their conquest of Europe. And that happened in 1450-ish, something like that. It's an epic tale. It involved one of the world's biggest cannons at the time, if not still one of the world's biggest cannons, and a really unique way of like surrounding Constantinople by sea. So if you want to read into the fall of Constantinople, that's a really great. In fact, like all of the whole story of Byzantium is kind of fascinating, but the fall of Constantinople is actually a really important aspect in history. And then afterwards, they kept on trying to push in, and like this push into Europe, I think, only ended in around the 1600s, maybe even later. And then we have the Crusades, and the Crusades started around 1100 AD, I think, was the first Crusade, the only real successful Crusade. And that is the West retaking parts of the old Roman Empire, parts of the old Byzantium Empire, that the Muslims had come in and taken by force previous to all of that. And like the Muslims are still pushing in. And the reason why it was successful, well, first of all, if memory serves, I think it was Pope Urban, Pope Urban the something or other, first, second, third, 115th, I don't know, it could be like Pius where there was a run of them. It was Pope Urban, and I believe, like historically, actually he called for the European nations to come together to retake Spain. And they came together and they're like, no, we want to retake the Holy Land. So they kind of left Spain in Muslim control, even though there's still a ton of fighting back and forth when they're, like, we're going to try to push in, no, we're going to push you back. We're going to try to, like, retake, no, and the Muslims are going to, like, push them back into France. So there was still a lot of that going on. But Pope Urban, I think, called to retake Spain, and instead they went over and retook the Holy Land, and one of the Crusades, I know they sacked Constantinople. But what ended up happening was they went all the way in to Muslim-occupied territory, and at the time, the territory, like, had only been, like, conquered about the time then, like, about 600 AD, around 600, 700 AD, so about the time they're still pushing into France. And they came in and they pushed it back. And they're able to do it because, like, at that point in time, the Caliphates were in disarray. The Muslim world was in disarray, didn't really get its act together again until Saladin came up. And, he started, like, retaking everything. That was with Richard the Lionheart, and that's where we get the Robin Hood story, if you are a Kevin Costner fan. And that all happened, and I want to say the Third Crusade, thereabouts, to kind of retake it. It was after the fall of Jerusalem, I believe, or the reconquest, or the reconquest of Jerusalem. Anyway, so what you have here is a period of sustained warfare in between the Muslim world and the Western world, where the Muslim world kept trying to push their way into Europe, and then a period where Europe had the upper hand and was able to retake areas that the Muslims had formerly conquered. Like, this all used to be part of Rome. And at the time, the Western world considered Rome, it's kind of, well, they still kind of consider Rome like it's, forebears. Like, what was the Roman Empire was the West. And then the Muslims took over a good chunk of that. And the Europeans finally got the upper hand. They're able to come back. They're able to retake Greece, which was under Muslim control, parts of it at least. They're able to kind of expand the borders of Byzantium, put up a new kingdom in Jerusalem. The Muslims still held Egypt. I don't think they ever really lost control of it. I mean, there's a few Templar strongholds in it, but I don't think the Muslims ever really lost control. Saladin was an Egyptian, I believe. And they were able to retake quite a bit of it. They reestablished Antioch, Edessa, not Odessa, Edessa with an E, and then a few other principalities from Greece all the way into the Holy Land. And then what happened was Islam got its act together, and they, kicked them out again. And I want to say again because it was formerly Rome. This was part of Byzantium. This was formerly controlled by Christianity and the Western powers, and then the Muslims were able to push them back, and then the war kept on going from around 720 AD, previously to 720 AD. So from around the early 700s, late 600 ADs, all the way into about 1450, when Constantinople finally fell. And then from there, you have the story of Dracula. And Dracula was fighting the Ottomans. He was fighting the Muslims. And, it was Turkey or Romania, present-day Romania. So, I mean, even then, like, we had the story of, the vampire. Because of the constant push from Islam to try to take over Europe. So, the point is, when you're being extremely disingenuous, when you want to paint the Crusades as this evil European scheme to come in and massacre everybody, when what it was just a period of time and over 700 years of sustained fighting, over 700 years of like the Muslims trying to push their way in and pretty much take over the known world. It was just the period of the Europeans being able to push back. So the First Crusade, the Second, the failed Children's Crusade. I want to say there were 8, maybe 11 Crusades again, like off the top of my head. Like I know it finally ended in the 1400s. The early 15th century is, I think, when the last Crusades, unless you count the reconquest of Spain and Granada, then it had that ended in around 1500. So this was a long, epic, ongoing war. This is longer than the 100 Years' War. This was the Muslims trying to conquer Europe, the Europeans pushing them back, retaking lands that the Muslims had conquered, the Muslims taking them back out again. But for some reason, we blame the entire thing on Europe, and we forget that, at least on the European and the really, really European and the present-day European end, that started in around 720 AD, with the war that would eventually continue, or the series of wars that will eventually continue and result in the Crusades, and then result into the Muslims retaking all of that. So this is well over 700 years of sustained, regular fighting, and Europe didn't instigate that. That is actually, this should be on the Muslims. And to paint all of this as a European thing, to say that Europe was wrong for doing it, again, that's being disingenuous. This is not a totally European war. We didn't start this, or they didn't start this. I'm an American. They actually didn't finish it. It really ended with a Muslim victory in most cases. I mean, the Muslims were kicked out of Spain, but they took Byzantium, and that was the last stronghold of the Roman Empire. It was the last part of the Roman Empire. It lasted until around 1450. Again, I know it fell before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but I don't know the exact dates. I'm sitting down in a car in McDonald's parking lot waiting to go back to work. So anyways, this was an ongoing, a very far-flung struggle, and we're blaming it all on the West, and that is patently false, historically inaccurate. And I've got a big problem with people that are being historically inaccurate, because right now what they're doing is they're rewriting history to suit a thesis, and that thesis is, I want to say, the Enlightenment is evil, and that's kind of what I see them pushing. So facts don't matter. Facts don't matter on the right. Facts don't matter on the left. Facts matter to me. So when we talk about the Crusades, let's get it right. The wars, the aggressions, all of that started well before 1100 or 1101 or whenever the First Crusade was. All of that started before that. Centuries before that. About 400 years of warfare before it. And it didn't end until almost the 16th century. And this is and for the majority of the time, Europe was on the defensive. So when you talk about the Crusades, you are talking about over 700 years of sustained fighting, most of which Europe was on the defensive, trying not to be invaded. And the Crusades were when they got the upper hand and were able to push back. So, and they only did it because, economic and political infighting in the Muslim world, but it was still the pushback. It wasn't the initial push. It wasn't the start of the war. It wasn't the start of the aggressions. It was actually a small part in a much greater series of, skirmishes, of wars, of Muslim conquest. This was just when Europe got the upper hand. And a lot of people, they just get that wrong. And some of it is just lack of knowledge. Some of it is because, Europe tends to paint itself as a bad guy in just about everything. You really don't hear that much. Even World War I with Germany. Yeah, World War II, they were the clear bad guys. World War I, they kind of got scapegoated into that. And the Germans are like, no, all our fault. And that's, like, I think, a very European thing to do. So I think with the Crusades, part of it is, like, definitely agenda-driven. We want to rewrite history to suit a thesis. But a big part of it, I really believe, is just a European thing to, yeah, no, that's our fault. We'll take full responsibility for that. And, in this case, they should. I mean, like, if you really want to talk about, like, something that they have a right to take full responsibility to, that was evil as hell, you want to talk about the Inquisition. But even then, that's a political purge, I think, more than it is really a religious thing. I should make a video on that in the future. But right now, this is just my correction for the Crusades. There's a lot more to it than people tend to make it out to be. And a big problem is oversimplifying everything that happened. Like, a huge problem is the oversimplification of history. And so now we have, like, not the full story, because, like, this is a very abridged story, but a little more detail at least. Now you understand that this started well before 1100, and this ended well after, like, the Crusades actually came to an end, like, officially. And this was not, like, just Europe, like, oh, we're going to take over this land that always belonged to them. No, this was much bigger than that. I should probably do a video about the rise of the Caliphate, because that's an incredibly awesome, like, part of history to read about. And, like, the Crusades are kind of with me. Like, Charles Martel I really like, and that story I think is really, really cool, because you always kind of root for the underdog. But the rise of the Caliphates is a pretty cool story, and especially, like, with the dawn of slavery, because a lot of people don't know that there weren't that many slaves in, like, Persia, despite what the movie 300 would tell you. The Zoroastrians outlawed slavery in 600 BCE, give or take. About the time, like, the reason why the Jews were, able to leave Babylon is because the Persian Empire took over and Zoroastrianism outlawed slavery. And they didn't get slavery again, that wasn't legal again, until the Muslims conquered that area and killed a ton of Zoroastrians. Islam became the dominant religion, and then suddenly they just went crazy at it, and that's another really cool story to tell. And I really want to do a video in the future about the fall of Constantinople, because I want to say the guy's name was, off the top of my head, Seti, something like that. He was, I know he was an Ottoman. I know his name began with an S. He was, like, the first. He was actually, he was an Ottoman, but he was an Ottoman from Mongolian blood, which is another awesome story to tell. But the way he took Constantinople was absolutely genius, and that's definitely a video that everyone needs to watch. It's a story everyone needs to hear, because it's a really cool part of history. Anyway, I have to get back to work. It's been about 23 minutes, so cheers.